Welcome to Heavy D Storytelling. I'm not as good at doing this as JJ is, but I am going to tell a story, and I'm going to tell you all about the story, but before I do that, I'm going to read from Psalm 119. This is the English Standard Version of the Bible. We're starting with verse 89 today. This is, again, the English Standard Version, like I just said, because I repeat myself a lot sometimes. And let me begin. Forever, O Lord, your word is firmly fixed in the heavens. Your faithfulness endures to all generations. You have established the earth, and it stands fast. By your appointment they stand this day, for all things are your servants. If your law had not been my delight, I would have perished in my affliction. I will never forget your precepts, for by them you have given me life. I am yours, save me, for I have sought your precepts. The wicked lie in wait to destroy me, but I consider your testimonies. I have seen the limit to all perfection, but your commandment is exceedingly broad. Oh, how I love your law! It is my meditation all the day. Your commandment makes me wiser than my enemies, for it is ever with me. I have more understanding than all my teachers, for your testimonies are my meditation. I understand more than the aged, for I keep your precepts. I hold back my feet from every evil way in order to keep your word. I do not turn aside from your rules, for you have taught me. How sweet are your words to my taste, sweeter than honey to my mouth. Through your precepts I get understanding. Therefore I hate every false way. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. I have sworn an oath and confirmed it, to keep your righteous rules. I am severely afflicted. Give me life, O Lord, according to your word. Accept my free will offerings of praise, O Lord, and teach me your rules. I hold my life in my hand continually, but I do not forget your law. The wicked have laid a snare for me, but I do not stray from your precepts. Your testimonies are my heritage forever, for they are the joy of my heart. I incline my heart to perform your statutes forever to the end. I hate the double-minded, but I love your law. You are my hiding place and my shield. I hope in your word. Depart from me, you evildoers, that I may keep the commandments of my God. Uphold me according to your promise, that I may lie, and let me not be put to shame in my hope. Hold me up, that I may be safe, and have regard for your statutes continually. You spurn all who go astray from your statutes, for their cunning is in vain. All the wicked of the earth you discard like dross. Therefore I love your testimonies. My flesh trembles for fear of you, and I am afraid of your judgments. And that is the end of where we will be reading today from God's Word. So, now we are beginning chapter, I believe it is 10 of, almost said the never-ending story, I don't know where that came from, Miracle on 34th Street. So in the last reading, Mr. Gailey would not let Santa Claus stay with him. Santa Claus was pleading and just begging and just said, "Oh, Mr. Gailey, please let me stay with you." And Mr. Gailey said no. And so Santa Claus stayed in the hallway. He got a cold and couldn't be Santa at Macy's anymore. And then Macy's went out of business. They went bankrupt and were not able to stay open because they lost the privilege of having Santa Claus in their midst. Here's Kimberly to say how it really happened.
Actually, it was quite the opposite. Mr. Gailey, he offered to let Chris, there was a spare room at his apartment, so he offered Chris the spare room. And so the next day, he goes over, and I think it's the next day anyway, and when he's done, when he's done doing his job, he and Mr. Gailey are wondering how they could get him and I keep forgetting her name. I'm so sorry.
Susan?
Yeah, him and Susan together.
Oh, Doris. Doris is the woman. Susan's the daughter.
Yeah, okay. They're conspiring how to get him and Doris together as, like, you know. So, he gets changed out of his Santa Claus costume and doesn't come back. And they look together all day, the entire day. And then Mr. Gailey gets back and he's in the bed. But they got to, he and Doris got to spend the whole day together. And they actually had a moment later when he told her what had happened. Actually, he said something like, "I think he's trying to play Cupid as well as Santa Claus." So, and then the next day, I think they saw the rival store owners taking pictures together with big smiles on their face. And so they're getting along now. And Susan is learning how to be a monkey. And then it quickly evolves from monkeys to a fairy queen with Kris Kringle as her loyal knight about to be sent off on a quest. I'm going to hand it off to Dad, who's going to read some more.
Hello again! So now we're going to begin Chapter 10 of Miracle on 34th Street. Let me begin. That evening, when the happy triumvirate came home to Doris's apartment. I don't know what it's a triumvirate. Somebody look it up and tell me what it is. All right. Came home to Doris's apartment. They saw Susan playing with 3 or 4 other children. Doris was surprised because up to now Susan had been more or less a lone wolf cub in the neighborhood, content to amuse herself in her own room. She had always complained that the other children played silly games, but here she was now, knee-deep in a game of fantasy, and liking it. Of course, she was not quite as experienced as the other kids in pretending to be a witch, but she was trying, and it was obvious that under Chris's coaching, her imagination was developing nicely. Doris couldn't help but be pleased as she watched Susan romp all over the furniture, trying to scare the other witches. Maybe the psychologist would not approve of a 6-year-old making believe she was a non-existent sorceress. Excuse me. But at the moment, Doris did, because she had never seen Susan enjoying herself quite so much. At dinner, Doris seemed a different person. She was happy, relaxed, warm, and feminine, the exact opposite of the stern Mrs. Walker of a few weeks ago. Kris was in the clouds. As he read a story to Susan after dinner, he glowed happily and assured the child that she would get her wish for Christmas. In the kitchen, Doris and Fred were helping Cleo with the dishes. Doris regretfully explained to Fred that she had to leave him for the evening. Mr. Sawyer, the vocational guidance expert, was giving a lecture before a study group of personnel heads. Doris was chairman of the committee. She had arranged for Sawyer to speak and was to introduce him. Much as she hated to go, she was afraid that she simply had to. The meeting had been planned weeks ago. Due to the nature of the lecture, Doris thought it just as well not to mention where she was going in front of Kris. After she had gone, Fred and Kris put Susan to bed. While Fred went next door to get his pipe and tobacco, Chris's eye caught a mimeographed postcard lying on Doris's desk. He picked it up and read it. Doris Walker, Chairman. We'll meet at 8:30 p.m. Wednesday, December 18, in the Neighborhood Center Auditorium, Greenwich Village. Speaker, Mr. Albert Sawyer. Subject, Exploding the Myth of Santa Claus. An open discussion will follow the lecture. Kris Kringle's whole being bristled as he read this. He picked up his hat and his cane and stalked out. At the neighborhood center, the usher politely refused to let Chris into the auditorium. Admission to the lecture was by invitation only, and Chris had left the card in Doris's apartment. But Mr. Kringle was determined to hear what this lunkhead, Sawyer had to say. Quietly, he decided to do some exploring. There must be other ways of getting into the place. He wandered slowly down a hallway which seemed to run along the side of the auditorium. After a bit, he came to a door which was unlocked. He opened it quietly and walked up a few steps. As he did so, he heard Doris's voice saying, "And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Albert Sawyer." There followed a polite round of applause. Chris found himself backstage. Sawyer began by saying that the setting in which he found himself seemed hardly appropriate for a lecture of this sort, but he hoped the audience would bear with him. It seemed that the Children's Theatre was giving its Christmas production on this stage, and the set, which contained a large window and a huge fireplace, could not be removed between performances. Sawyer was at the front of the stage, reading his speech at a lectern. "The symbolic figure of Santa Claus, St. Nicholas, or Kris Kringle," he began, "represents a classic expression of the wishful dreaming of all children. He is the omnipotent giver, the generous father. Mature adults who seek to perpetuate this myth reveal themselves as incomplete and neurotic personalities. They are clinging to infantile fantasies and show themselves unable to face reality." This last remark was greeted with an audible burst of laughter from the audience. Sawyer looked up, disturbed. He did not know that behind him, at the back of the stage, the figure of Kris Kringle was framed in the large cellophane window. But Doris had spotted Chris, and she was in a panic. She had no idea how he had gotten there, or what he would do next. Still mystified by the laughter, Sawyer continued with his lecture. People often wish to act as Santa, he said, and this they did to compensate for strong feelings of guilt. Fathers who felt guilty toward their children showered them with gifts, and wealthy men who played Santa by vast philanthropies covered feelings of guilt about the money they had made at the expense of others. As Sawyer continued, Chris behind the scenery began to sputter and fume and shake his cane in anger. Doris anxiously tried to quiet him with grimaces and gestures, but as Sawyer's remarks grew more and more condemning, Chris' mutterings grew more and more voluble. Chris now had but one idea: to get out from behind the scenery onto the stage. He finally saw a small aperture in the backdrop. At that moment, Sawyer dealt a terrific body blow to the whole subject of Santa Claus. "Far from doing good in the world, this vicious myth has done more harm than opium," he declared. This last was too much for Mr. Kringle. Before Doris knew what had happened, he had burst out onto the stage. His entrance could not have been more dramatic. Right in the middle of this diatribe against Santa, the living image of Santa Claus appeared out of the fireplace. Chris's entrance was too much for the audience. They rocked and screamed with laughter, but to Mr. Kringle it was not funny. Sawyer was astounded to see Chris, and he was also very angry. "Now look here," Chris began. "I am giving this lecture, Mr. Kringle," Sawyer declared. The name of Kringle brought another laugh which Sawyer had not expected. Doris was on her feet now, vainly pleading with Chris. "This is to be an open discussion," replied Kringle. "I believe I have the right to be heard. I don't know anyone better qualified than myself to answer your absurd remarks." "The discussion will take place after the lecture," said Mr. Sawyer. "Very well," said Chris. He walked to one side of the stage, seated himself on a prop bench, and waited for Sawyer to resume. Completely flustered, poor Mr. Sawyer attempted to continue, but Chris was still the center of attention. Each time Sawyer made a remark which seemed ridiculous to Chris, his face clearly indicated his reaction. All Chris had to do was raise one eyebrow or touch his nose with his cane to bring a roar of laughter from the listeners. It was at this point that Fred slipped into the back of the auditorium. Having exhausted all means of locating Chris, he had found the card on Doris's desk and rushed here to tell her. When he saw Chris peacefully seated on the platform, he gave a relieved grin and sat down to watch the proceedings. Sawyer became more and more confused as he struggled to continue. He began to stutter and to mix words up. His reference to Clantha sauce sent the audience into stitches, and the more they laughed, the worse Sawyer grew. Finally, one sentence came out so garbled that Mr. Sawyer had to start it all over again. Chris could not resist the temptation. He held up 2 fingers at Mr. Sawyer. "How many fingers do you see?" he asked. This was too much for Mr. Sawyer. He turned white with rage. "I refuse to continue," he stormed, "until this old jackanapes is removed from the platform." Doris went on her feet, beseeching Chris to be reasonable. "I am entirely reasonable, my dear," said Chris, "but I intend to show the absurdity of all this hogwash Mr. Sawyer has been spouting, and until I do, I'll not move 1 inch. "Oh, you won't, eh?" said Sawyer, advancing ominously. "We'll see about that." Mr. Kringle held his ground. "Jackanapes, am I?" he said ominously, and he toyed with his cane as Sawyer approached. "Don't you threaten me with that stick," roared Sawyer. "Leave this platform at once, do you hear?" Chris raised his cane, preparing to defend himself, and Sawyer grabbed for it furiously. With a quick tug, Mr. Kringle pulled it free. As he did so, the stick grazed Mr. Sawyer's cheek. "He hit me!" screamed Sawyer, jumping back. "I wish I had," said Mr. Kringle scornfully. Doris quickly stepped between them, trying to restore order. "Look here, Mrs. Walker," said Sawyer, nursing a slightly red spot on his cheek. "If you insist upon defending this dangerous maniac, I shall call the police at once." "No, no," cried Doris anxiously. Sawyer at last saw his chance to do some face-saving and make an exit. Things had got entirely out of control. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "the lecture is terminated." He turned to Doris. "Very well, I shall not call the police. Now, I will see you in Mr. Shellhammer's office tomorrow morning, and we shall decide on a course of action." He glared at Chris. "Society has ways of protecting itself against such people." And with that, he strode from the platform. Chapter 11. Early the next morning, Doris found herself facing the combined wrath of the Messrs. By the way, I really liked the way it took place better in the book than in the movie. And if you haven't watched the movie, then after we're finished with the book, go ahead and pull out the movie. It's probably on Netflix or Amazon or something, and just go ahead and give it a watch, because it's definitely worth your time. All right, so back to the beginning of Chapter 11. Early the next morning, Doris found herself facing the combined wrath of Messrs. Sawyer and Shellhammer. Wow, I've never seen Mr. in a plural form before, so it's Messrs. Sawyer and Shellhammer. Sawyer had given a lurid amount of Chris's behavior the night before. He had left no doubt but that Kringle was a dangerously deranged man. He accused him of profanity and violence. Doris attempted to refute Sawyer's exaggerations. Chris's appearance at the lecture was unfortunate, but he had not really done anything violent. Shellhammer was disturbed. Sawyer had convinced him that Kringle was extremely dangerous. After all the publicity and build-up, he could easily turn out to be a terrific boomerang to Macy's. Just let Gimble find out that Macy's Santa Claus was a nut. Good grief! They did not dare to imagine the possibilities. Kringle was dynamite, and Mrs. Walker was responsible. She had hired him. She had known about his delusion. Mr. Sawyer was only thankful that he had been the victim instead of one of the innocent little children Chris had dangled on his knee. "The problem," said Sawyer, "is what to do about this poor deluded maniac." "We've got to do something at once," said Shellhammer. "I don't believe it," Mrs. Walker was saying. "He's just a kind old man. I'm sure that he won't ever—" But he will, Mrs. Walker," Mr. Sawyer assured her. "He's evidently suffered some sudden change. He's entered into a violent phase." "But Dr. Pierce assured us that he could never... that could never happen in this type of case. Chris's delusion is only for good." Dr. Pierce is not a psychiatrist, said Sawyer tartly. Neither are you, snapped Doris. Well, the very least that should be done, said Sawyer, is to have Mr. Kringle thoroughly examined by a competent psychiatrist at once. This seemed very sound to Mr. Shellhammer. Doris objected. Chris had passed dozens of such examinations with flying colors, she pointed out. But there's no harm in it, Shellhammer argued. If they can agree with Dr. Pierce that he's harmless, he can come right back. And if they don't, you've certainly done the right thing, added Sawyer. Doris was quite shaken. She knew that Chris had not been violent. She disliked Sawyer intensely, and she was sure that he was exaggerating the situation. But under the circumstances, Mr. Shellhammer was right, she knew. Anyway, Chris would obviously pass any sanity test with flying colors, and he would be back on the job that afternoon. Doris acquiesced with a nod. Mr. Sawyer was eager and obliging. He would be glad to arrange for the examination right away, he said. His one aim was to get Kringle away from the store as quickly as possible. There was no time to lose. He knew the quickest and easiest way to do it, too, but there was no need to mention that to Mrs. Walker. The only problem now, said Sawyer, is how to get him out of the store without creating another situation. In his present condition, he would most certainly react with violence. Mrs. Walker, you'll have to explain it to him, said Shellhammer. After all, you're his friend. He trusts you. But Doris flatly refused. She agreed that it must be done, but she simply couldn't do it. She had come to be far too fond of the old man. She couldn't bring herself to hurt him. Never mind, said Sawyer with a quiet nod to Shellhammer. We don't really need Mrs. Walker. I know how we can do it. Chris was back on his dais as usual, greeting the never-ending line of youngsters as Mr. Shellhammer approached him. They wanted to have Mr. Kringle's picture taken with the mayor down at City Hall. Would Chris mind going? Not a bit, said Chris. I'd be delighted to meet his honor, but I have a 5 o'clock appointment with Mr. Macy. Oh, you'll be back in plenty of time for that, Mr. Shellhammer assured him. These two gentlemen would take him. A car was waiting, and so Chris left his dais and went with the men. It was not until he entered the limousine and saw Mr. Sawyer sitting in the front seat that Chris suspected anything. Where to? The driver asked. Bellevue, said Sawyer. Chris started to rise angrily, but the car was already in motion, and the men on either side of him quietly forced him back into his seat. He sat there stunned and staring straight ahead as the car moved slowly with the traffic down the rain-soaked street. Then he finally spoke. Does Mrs. Walker know about any of this? He asked. Of course she does, said Sawyer. She arranged the whole thing. From that moment on, Mr. Kringle was a beaten man. If Doris could do this to him, all he had worked so hard for was a lost and hopeless cause. It didn't matter a bit what happened to him now. All the rest of the way to Bellevue, he never uttered a word, and even when they arrived and he was taken inside, he seemed to have lost all interest in what was going on. And for those of you who don't know, Bellevue in New York State is a very famous, it's called a sanatorium. It's where they take mentally insane patients so that they can not hurt people. So it's not like a mental hospital. It's really more like a place where they store people.
Sanatorium, sanity.
Yeah. Exactly. All right, so Chapter 12. For Doris, the rest of the afternoon was an endless, unreal ordeal of suspense. She couldn't force herself to remain seated at her desk for more than a few minutes at a time, let alone concentrate upon her work. She kept going to the door and looking at the dais, hoping to see that Chris had returned, but the dais remained empty, and her anxiety increased. She tried to learn where Chris had been taken, but all that Mr. Shellhammer knew was that Mr. Sawyer had arranged for the examination, and that he had gone with Mr. Kringle in the car. It wasn't till nearly closing time that she finally learned the truth. Then she received a hurried and furious telephone call from Fred. He had just hung up from talking to the psychopathic ward at Bellevue. They had asked him to bring down Mr. Kringle's toilet articles right away. It was some doctor down there, Fred told her indignantly. He said Chris wouldn't be needing any street clothes for quite a while. Bellevue? So that's where Sawyer took him. Doris' voice was choked with rage. What's happened anyway? Fred demanded. What's this all about? Doris quickly told him the story. Sawyer had made all kinds of threats. She had no choice but to consent to an examination. Sawyer had been too clever to mention Bellevue, of course. But why did you let them take him anywhere? Demanded Fred. Doris tried to explain. How could she ignore last night? Suppose Sawyer had sent for the police. But Fred had no time to argue. He had to get to the hospital right away. I'll tell you later, Doris, he said as he hung up. At Bellevue, Mr. Kringle had been interviewed, questioned, examined, put through the regular routine. He had moved from one doctor to another and from one room to another in a dull haze of indifference. He had answered questions absently, often said yes to ridiculous questions because he had paid no attention. All he kept saying to himself over and over again was, how could she have done it? How could she have done it? Sometimes his lips had silently formed the words. The alert young psychiatrists had noted this and made appropriate entry in their reports. Now they had taken his Santa Claus costume away and substituted a limp gray dressing gown that was much too big for Chris. They had placed him in a long, bare room with iron bars in front of the narrow windows. There were a lot of other men in the room, all clad in shroud-like dressing gowns, but Mr. Kringle was hardly aware of them. He sat in the chair in which a white-coated attendant had placed him and stared blankly at the wall. He was still sitting there when Fred found him, a little tired old man with a white beard. All the youthful, eager brightness was gone from his eyes. This is a lot of nonsense, Chris, Fred told him. You're just as sane as anybody, and a whole lot saner than most. Chris shook his head, almost imperceptibly. I'll have you out of here in no time, Fred said heartily, but Chris did not want to be released. Doris had deceived him, just when he had been convinced that she was really beginning to believe in him. She must have just been humoring me all the time, he said sadly. If that's how sane people behave, I'd rather stay in here with the others. But Doris had no idea what Sawyer was up to, Fred told him. He threatened to send for the police. She thought he was going to take you to the private doctor. I'm glad to know that, said Chris. But why didn't she come to me herself and explain the whole thing? Because she didn't want to hurt you, Chris. Chris nodded slowly. Yes. I'm a nice old man, and she felt sorry for me. It was more than that, said Fred. But Mr. Kringle shook his head. No, she has doubts, Fred. That's why she was only sorry. If you had been dragged off here, she would have been furious. What if she did have doubts, Fred argued. She hasn't really believed in anything for years. You're not giving her a fair chance, Chris. It's not just Doris, Chris said. It's men like Sawyer. He's dishonest, selfish, vicious. Yet he's called normal, and I'm not. He's out there, and I'm in here. Well, if he's normal, I don't want to be. I'd rather stay in here. But you can't just think of yourself, Chris. What happens to you matters to a lot of other people. People like me who believe in you and what you stand for, and people like little Susan who are just beginning to. You can't quit now, Chris. Don't you see? Chris thought this over, and as he did, the light began to come back into his eyes. Maybe you're right, he said slowly. Maybe you're right at that. Of course I am, said Fred with a great relief. I knew you wouldn't let us down. I should be ashamed of myself, said Mr. Kringle, the familiar ring back in his voice. And I am. Maybe we won't win, Fred, but we'll go down swinging. Now you're talking, Fred said jubilantly as he rose. Don't you worry, Chris. Just sit tight and I'll have you out of here in no time. But it wasn't as easy as Fred had thought. After a number of unsatisfactory interviews, Fred finally managed to see the chief psychiatrist, Dr. Rogers. He was a kindly, quiet man. He sent for Chris's file and studied the papers carefully. Fred explained to Dr. Rogers that he had lived with Chris for quite a time. He was, of course, as sane as any man. This whole procedure was ridiculous, merely revenge for personal humiliation on the part of Mr. Sawyer. But Dr. Rogers was quietly unconvinced. He was sorry, but he couldn't agree with Fred at all. Mr. Kringle was definitely unbalanced. If not actually dangerous, at least potentially so. Every interview, every test led clearly to this same conclusion. Mr. Kringle's mind was far from normal. Not only could they not release Chris, but on the basis of these reports they would have to file immediate commitment papers. It was only then that Fred fully realized what had happened. Chris had given wrong answers and failed these tests deliberately. And at the same time, Fred realized that it was hopeless to try to convince Dr. Rogers of the truth. Sawyer had managed to get Mr. Kringle into this place, but Chris himself had carefully blocked any chance of getting out of it, and Fred had promised Chris his freedom. He had talked himself way out on a long, long limb, and now he felt it cracking. He thanked Dr. Rogers and left. He needed time to think. His job was almost impossible, and he knew it. And we will begin there tomorrow with chapter 13. We'll read the next 3 chapters, 13, 14, and 15 tomorrow. I hope you're enjoying the reading of Miracle on 34th Street, one of my favorite Christmas stories. And God bless you guys. Merry Christmas. Almost there. And have a good night.